All right. Can everyone hear me? Making sure before I dive in here.
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. I am super glad to be here. Thank you for having me and welcome to the forum. And to be perfectly clear, the she who can't say that in this title is absolutely me. Over the course of my career, I've said a lot of things I apparently wasn't supposed to. I'm probably going to say more things I'm not supposed to say today. Lots of things that are unprofessional or uncivil or inappropriate or unreasonable or backlashy or just really not nice. Won't be the first time I've had those labels pinned on me. Won't be the last. But you'll be happy to know that I originally intended to put a content alert here for cussing, and I wound up not needing to do that. So there's that. Instead, I do have a few props today, so you might want to adjust your Zoom view so that you're seeing me as well as the slides. As it happens, she can't say that, can she? It's actually close to a direct quote from a peer reviewer for my very first published journal article in Keeper at the Roach Motel. This reviewer asked the Library Trends issue editor, who told me this story much later on, they asked the editor whether I was allowed to say some of the things that I was saying in that article. Notably, this reviewer didn't say, that's displaying some ugly bias and it needs to be rethought. Didn't say, that's not actually true. Did not say, that's missing something, it needs some nuance. Did not say, this doesn't cite what so-and-so said about thingy thing. All of which are entirely legit things to say during a peer review because they are tied to editorial standards and to publishing ethics. Instead, this reviewer said, she can't say that, can she? Which what? I thought this profession kind of didn't agree with censorship because attempted censorship is what that was. And I'm grateful to the issue editor and to Library Trends editorial leadership for replying that, yes, actually, I could say that, and they would print it, and here we are. And since this is a publishing conference, I can say that I'm also grateful to Library Trends for good typography. This is just a really pleasant, readable, classic page design, and I'm a fan. But I ain't mad. I ain't mad at that reviewer. Really, I ain't mad. In all honesty, I think that reviewer was trying to protect me, baby librarian that I was at the time. And I think this because of something that happened at about the same time the Roach Motel was coming out. I was interviewed by Rachel Singer Gordon for a sidebar in her book, What's the Alternative?, for a chapter on non-traditional jobs and still traditional libraries, talking about library tech in general and institutional repositories specifically. And in that interview, I said this. Librarianship is still deciding how it wants to react to computers. Some librarians, prominently Michael Gorman and Rory Litwin, genuinely believe that computer programming is not something librarians should do. So yeah, I said that. And with 2020 hindsight, it was pretty ad hominem and impolitic of me. Today, I'd have had the sense to say seem to believe, and I've left out the names. But it was printed in the book. What you're seeing on the slide is straight from a photocopy. And Rachel didn't change anything. That was all me. Shortly after the book was published, I got an email from one of those two. I declined to say which, but the other one was copied on it. And that email had this threat vibe right out of Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Be a real shame if something happened to your brand new career. I didn't answer. You know what? I'm still here. Now, that email was not about holding me publicly accountable for my published words, which is also a legitimate thing to do. Gorman and Litwin were fully entitled to say out loud and in public that I misstated their beliefs, and how dare I, if they wanted to. Certainly had all the soapbox they needed. Gorman had been ALA president not long before this, and Litwin had founded a whole entire press. But public accountability is generally a public thing. This wasn't, nor was it opening a dialogue, which also would have been okay, best I can tell. This was a private attempt to intimidate me, then a baby librarian, out of speaking my sense of the beliefs of two very powerful and established librarians. In other words, that email was kicking down and attempting censorship. And I think that Roach Motel reviewer knew this kind of thing happens and wanted to protect me from it. Kind impulse. So I ain't mad at them, even though I think that what they did was not actually okay. If you think that shut me up, have you even met me? Shutting up is kind of not my thing. But the truth is I have actually done it. And I've done it to avoid hurting colleagues. Such as this piece, Journal of eScience Librarianship, in which the peer reviewers once again questioned whether I was allowed to say some of the things that I was saying, and this time the editors went along. If it had been just me, I would have dug my heels in, because again, this wasn't a question of accuracy or bias or citation cartels or data problems or human subjects ethics or plagiarism or any other actual problem of publishing ethics or standards. It was just that I wasn't being relentlessly cheerful about everything ever. And with 2020 hindsight, I was right not to be. But Regina and Rebecca were my co-authors, and if I remember right, at least one of them was tenure track at the time, really needed this publication to happen. So I grumbled to myself and I made the requested changes. Helped reconcile me a little bit that I was able to tell the story my way in another context in a presentation whose slides and talk notes I put online. So yeah, if you compare my talk notes for Manufacturing Serendipity to what got published in the journal, you can see pretty easily what the journal censored. Because I repeat, that was censorship in the LIS literature. There is no war in Ba Sing Se, and there are no problems in how academic libraries handle research data management services. Now, the flip side of being a loudmouth, of course, is that I've had to take my lumps when I've earned them, and I absolutely have earned some lumps. Some days, like for example today, I invite lumps deliberately and I keep my aspirin handy. But some days I don't. I'm the first to admit that I don't always calibrate my big mouth right. Either way, I have to take the lumps, and I do. By way of example, these days I laugh about what being librarian non grata in the entire state of Minnesota. Sorry, y'all, I don't know if I can make the Library Publishing Forum next year. But yeah, after giving this keynote at Minnesota Library Association annual, that hit a little bit harder than I meant it to. And I laugh because what else am I gonna do? But the truth is that I'm sorry. I ended up kicking down myself in this one, and I definitely should have had more consideration for the people who are listening to me. I will take all the lumps that I earned for that. It so happens that I got attempted censored again over this one. I've told that story in other contexts, but in the interest of time, I will let it go today. But keep that in mind for everything else that I'm going to say today. In the United States, libraries are in the middle of a horrifying censorship crisis, which is why censorship is kind of top of my mind. I'm teaching my library school students what little they can do to respond to all this, and I wish from the bottom of my heart that I did not have to. I am definitely not saying that all the stuff that I've talked about so far is on that level. Absolutely not. Look, incoming ALA president Emily Drabinski had her own university's leadership try to shut her up. This is all LIS insider baseball by comparison. But even so, as library publishers, I think we maybe want to set an example here. No fields literature is supposed to be about shutting people up when they have defensible points to make, as long as they make those points without doing anything that's straight up unethical. But what I noticed is that we in LIS are actually unfortunately good at censoring one another, including in our literature sometimes. And what I've learned from my own experience and that of other librarians, and you may have figured it out already just from what I've said so far, is that there's a highly specific thing that gets censored. Anything from one librarian that says that other librarians might have done something wrong, like ever. We're not supposed to say this is bad in public about our profession or anyone in it, even if it's true, even for just calling a spade a shovel. Because it's our profession and critiquing it is somehow, I don't know, disloyal or something? Are there loyalty tests in librarianship that nobody ever told me about? And of course, if there's a power differential involved, the silencing gets worse. And the way to shut people up, apparently, is to hassle them outside the public eye and with no accountability. That's why that Library Trends reviewer asked to censor me during the confidential peer review process. That's why Gorman or Litwin, still not saying which, got all up in my baby-brarian emails. That's why the Journal of E-Science Librarianship asked me to tone my critiques of my institution down, again during confidential peer review. And that's why I'm persona non grata in Minnesota. I broke the unwritten rules about keeping every critique ever private. In recent years, this style of decorum-invoking censorship has been called out. And I definitely don't think it's coincidence that the callers out have mostly been women of color. This is all tied in with Katrina Davis Kendrick's formulation of library nice, which, as Kendrick points out, super gendered, super racialized. It's absolutely tied in with Fabazi Itar's concept of vocational awe, in which librarians too often not only believe, but enforce this illusion that we all run around with little feathery halos over our heads. We can do no wrong because of our sacred mission. So shout out to these two brilliant librarians whose work has taught me a lot. But look, no patience for the illusion enforcement anymore. I am so done with illusions of sacred perfection that must never be broken. We cannot fix problems with our profession if nobody is allowed to actually talk about them out loud. And the flip side of that is that if we're actually serious about being professionals with integrity, we all need to take our lumps, often in public. I can tell you from bountiful experience, this is not fun. But I can also tell you that it is survivable. I have had to do it, I have done it, and I am still here. Perfection is not a thing, no matter how much we might want it to be. So I hope it's a little bit reassuring that a few lumps don't mean the end. And that's me. What about y'all? Why do you, as library publishing professionals, care about being able to discuss suboptimal practices openly? Because surely there are no poor practices in library or LIS publishing. All right, yeah, fooling no one here. Y'all probably have worse stories than I do. I definitely have some stories. Once or twice I've been the story. Ask me about the time I accidentally sent a piece to one of its authors for peer review. Whoopsie. But one thing I'm saying is the LIS literature and y'all as the LIS publishing contingent, these are a big part of the public face of our profession. So we need that public face to reflect what we say is important and what we say is okay. So if we here today are going to make a bid for being part of the scholarly publishing scene more generally, and that's one thing we're here to do, right? We need to put our own discipline's publishing house in order. There is no outsourcing library ethics in the LIS literature, just as one example. Not to alphabet soup data protection law, not to IRBs, not to our institutional data governance, heavens no, not to the Committee on Publishing Ethics, not to anybody. And among other things, that means attention to patron privacy, since we claim it as central to our disciplinary ethics. Privacy is totally where our stated ideals, actual practices, and professional literature stop being insider baseball and start to be part of our public face. Here's my example of LIS research and publication that's got serious privacy and other ethics issues. Not saying it's the only example, definitely not. Not even saying it's the most important example necessarily, but it's the example I spent the last 5 years on, so it's the example you're getting, library learning analytics. Which for those who are not in academic libraries, I'll give you the Siemens 2012 definition, kind of the classic. Learning analytics is the, quote, measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of student and other data for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs, unquote. Now, I actually disagree quite strongly with Siemens that understanding and improving learning is the only purpose that learning analytics researchers have. And in fact, library learning analytics is a great example. If you read the methods and advocacy pieces about library learning analytics, you discover right away that it's not about helping students, it's about making libraries look good. Which is a whole can of ethical worms right there. That's not supposed to be what human subjects research is for. Self-interested research using other people as lab rats has historically gone in very ugly directions very quickly. And then there's the me definition of learning analytics, which is assessment by student surveillance. Learning analytics runs on intentional student surveillance through data exhaust. Library learning analytics, at least as it's mostly been done so far, is intentional surveillance of students as library patrons through data exhaust. And this is a specific variant of a general virus that's infecting the LIS literature and libraries more generally. Increased risks to patrons and even breaches of patron privacy through use and abuse of patron data. What you're looking at, and if you haven't read this, I strongly encourage you to, is an example of library patrons schooling their library and its librarians on data privacy. What has even happened to my profession? We should be ashamed of this. I am ashamed of this. I don't know. Can I say that? Can I say that some librarians are doing some horribly and embarrassingly wrong things with patron data? Am I allowed to use the word surveillance about library research? Can I say that the LIS literature contains plenty of articles and conference papers that need to be retracted for abuse of patron data and breach of patron privacy? I hope I can say all that because I just said it. I stand by it. I will take any lumps I have to for saying it. And I thank the Library Publishing Coalition for giving me a soapbox to say it from. I am not, despite appearances, a total dimwit. I do know what my reputation as a speaker is. It takes a certain amount of strength of character to invite me anyway, so thank you, LPC. I appreciate you. Anyway, one of the interesting things about learning analytics, both outside and inside libraries, is how entrenched it became before anybody asked one single student what they thought about it. What a power trip, y'all. Fortunately, that's changed. Thank you, Melanie. I pitched in on a multi-site research project. There have been other research projects, so we now know some things about what students think, and at least a few students have had a chance to ask us what the heck we're doing. And I have to say, if you read the research, a lot of student respondents take this in stride. They are accepting of surveillance in ways that I find absolutely horrifying. And they trust us in ways I don't think we always deserve. A lot of students in this research consider surveillance normal and don't seem to have direct experience of surveillance harms yet, so they have trouble thinking of surveillance as problematic. And that rhymes, I have to say, with what I see in my classrooms. I'm pretty good at shaking them out of this complacency, if I do say so myself, but lots of them need that shaking, is what I'm saying here. But even so, students have said loudly and clearly across existing research that they want some fences built around learning analytics. If I had to boil their expectations down, I'd say they wanted three things. One, to be told what's going on. What data is being collected and retained, what's being done with it, and they want us to be quite specific about both those things. Two, to be able to say yes or especially no at any time and have that choice respected. Three, they want de-identified data, rightly or wrongly, and I would actually argue that they're naive in this. they felt safer if the data under analysis didn't have their name or their campus identifier on it anywhere. And honestly, this breaks my poor little librarian heart into pieces. None of this is actual privacy. They could have asked for actual privacy. But this is what they asked for. It's okay. Keep it in mind as I go on. After the multi-site research project that I was part of concluded last year, I decided that it was kind of pointless to argue about data practices in library learning analytics if we didn't actually know much about what those data practices were. So I put together a gigantic pile of citations to research in and around library learning analytics. And before I dive in to what I did with that pile and what I found out from it, need to remind everybody that this study has not passed peer review yet. Indeed, it's been rejected once already from a peer-reviewed journal. I have it under review at another. So turn on your skepticism filters. With that said, what I did was I went through the pile for projects that use non-self-reported, so no surveys, no interviews, no focus groups. I'm talking about data that's collected on students that isn't actual student input, right? So projects using data on students to show some kind of benefit of library use to student success. And I should also mention, I limited to English language work. There was no way I could properly evaluate every cited work that I found. A lot of it was in languages that I don't read. So there's a huge US bias here, which I acknowledge and I do regret. So I ended up with 62 projects, 46 of them American, represented by 102 documents. Most of the documents were journal articles, but there were also conference papers, conference slides, a few dissertations, book chapters, and reports. And then I went through this pile to assess how these researchers were using data and whether they were paying due attention to human subjects ethics, to library ethics, and to information privacy. One thing I found is that tons of this stuff looks to be getting no ethical review, whatever. Out of 62 projects, only 16 documented that they had. In the United States, out of 46 projects, 11 passed IRB, 4 were declared exempt, and the remaining 31, nothing they mentioned, which apparently not mentioning IRB review for projects that actually got it is a thing at some LIS journals. I can't figure out why, and I don't think it's very ethics-minded. But people I trust tell me that this is so. Hey, LPC, you might want to say something about that in your publishing ethics materials. And some of you are yelling at me in your heads right now that so-called quality assurance or quality control projects, assessment projects may not have to be ethics reviewed. Sometimes IRBs flat out refuse to review them even, and yeah, I know that. Got another thing I'm writing where I talk about that because I think that's part of the problem here. Assessment practices absolutely can do harm, especially when they're based on surveillance. And both in librarianship and in the academy more generally, we're not really reckoning with that. But I think it's also worth mentioning that this lack of ethics reviewing puts y'all in a bad spot as publishing people. You are the final frontier for ethics. You can get called out for an author's bad ethics at any time. And you have to make these ethical calls after all the work's been done, and quite possibly a lot of the harm to patrons. I'm just saying, do not envy y'all here. Let me put my vocational halo back on for a second. We're librarians, right? And librarians are thoughtful people with whole entire ethics codes who protect the privacy of our patrons from the big bad data wolves, right? Especially vulnerable patrons like students, right? So do we really need ethical review? We couldn't possibly have done anything sketchy, right? And especially we wouldn't publish anything sketchy, right? All right, I want to be fair about this. Some things I looked at for this study were well done. For example, there was this one piece from just last year that ended up in my study by Whitcower, McInnes, and Pope that I thought was outstandingly good. The authors thoroughly considered and explained their ethics decisions, and those decisions were solidly defensible. Really a model for how to do this kind of work right. But was everything I looked at like that? Let's find out. We sure are tossing sensitive data around like hacky sacks. There's a standard sensitive demographic stuff, including in combinations that probably make it possible to pick a fair few individual students out of the pack, even if the data doesn't contain their names or identifiers. And these re-identifiable students are likely to cluster in already minoritized, already over-surveilled groups, because those groups are numerical outliers in most of our institutions. But wait, there's more. The survey my multi-site research colleagues and I did showed that students hold financial information to be extremely private, and socioeconomic status is broadly held to be sensitive across sources of data guidance. Fair few of us not really respecting that in our eagerness to dig through any data we can find or our institution will give us. I also found a fair few studies that looked at various aspects of students' high school records, which surprised me. I wasn't expecting this. And I bet it'd be an unpleasant surprise for a lot of students who thought they were done being judged on what they did in high school. Then there's location data, first-gen status, national origin or citizenship, military or veteran status, and one study even looked at disability status, I ask you. But it all got published or presented or passed a thesis committee, one way or another, mostly without ethical review. Speaking of names and identifiers crossed with sensitive data, students want us to use only de-identified data, and a lot of the studies I looked at not respecting that. Now I have to add, even the projects that said they were trying, way too many of them either didn't explain their de-identification techniques at all, that was really common, or they were using techniques that were pretty flagrantly inadequate or didn't take re-identification potential into account. But all these projects got out there, one way or another. Journals, books, conferences, or getting past a thesis review committee. In addition to de-identification, students said they wanted to be told what was going on. Are we telling them? Most projects in my study didn't. I particularly love the one that was like, well, in the million pages of click-through legalese students saw when they signed up for their campus ID, campus told them somebody could do research on them. Come on. In what world is that genuine notice? It is a fig leaf rationalization for not doing the work of telling students what we're up to. How are we not better than this? Yet somebody publish that, or let it be presented or whatever. As for consent, the numbers are even worse. Whitcower, McInnes, and Pope is one of the informed consent 5, by the way, and good for them. And yeah, some of you are yelling at me in your heads right now that QA, QC assessment may not be required by policy or law to get informed consent. Yeah, I know that, but here's the thing. Do you think students care about the distinction between research and assessment? Especially when there's actually less ethical oversight for assessment work. But the results, the data still get put out there in public. I don't think they care. I don't even see why they should. This legalistic, hair-splitting view of consent and ethical review is a pointless hoop to jump through or even run away from. I think that's part of the problem here. Fundamentally, it's not okay to traipse through students' data exhaust without telling students about it and giving them a voice in it. Even if library privacy ethics were not what they are, as a matter of basic respect for student agency and student autonomy, it's not okay. And the hoops are there to guard against it. Though in practice, as we're seeing, they do so very imperfectly, which just says to me, we need to design some better hoops. Here's the thing, I was not expecting to find this much of, that I completely blew my stack about. I stomped around my home office here cussing like a sailor. I was so mad. 11 projects, most of them American, actually thought it was okay to surveil individual student subjects of interest. Several times, this included the exact information objects that these students used. Half of these projects even share data outside the library. This is a bright line. in library ethics, folks, the brightest. The subjects that individual patrons are interested in, never mind the exact information objects they used, are none of our or anybody else's business, except when we cannot avoid knowing. And even then, we are supposed to forget as soon as we can, because our patrons deserve safety from our shenanigans too. I believe the choice to use data on individual specific information use merits article and conference retractions on library ethics grounds. I acknowledge that that's going to cause some of us some career damage, and I am genuinely sorry for that. But we just cannot let this stay in the LIS literature and retain our professional integrity. And maybe Dorothea Salo can't say that, but I just said it anyway. I'm also saying that if y'all's LIS journal and conference portfolios don't have guidelines that say to desk reject anything, recording or analyzing what information individual patrons looked at, those guidelines need to exist, because those projects got out there, didn't they? Didn't they? Vocational law halo back on. I'm speaking to the Library Publishing Coalition, right? The librarians. Library publishers aren't the big pigs or the bottom feeders who publish any old thing and screw the ethics, right? Yeah, nah, not a defense here. Of the 73 journal articles I read for this study, at least 27 were in librarian-managed open access journals. And yeah, I mean, I expected college and research libraries would be at the top of this list because it's ACRL's journal, and ACRL went all in on learning analytics more than a decade ago. But to me, that just means ACRL and that editorial board need to take their lumps here. As I said, though, not all the news is dismal. We have decent examples in our literature to work from, like Whitcower, McInnes, and Pope. But enough is dismal that I hope that I've shown that there's a mess here. Big, hairy, ugly, ethical mess. And I've only given you the edited highlights. There's more in the article that I have under review that I didn't have time to talk about today. This isn't the only patron data mess in our literature that I think urgently needs some critical examination. There is stuff going on with proxy server logs that absolutely should not be. Same with chat reference logs. I saw some troubling use of web trackers in one or two learning analytics projects. Can't believe learning analytics is the only place it's happening. What's going on with ILS analytics in the literature, I'm not actually totally sure, but I suspect it needs looking at. And while I was assembling and filtering citations for this study, I ran into a lot of data-centric methods papers, as you'd expect. Now, they weren't eligible for inclusion in my study under the criteria that I'd set up, but I looked through a fair few of them anyway, and it absolutely appalled me how many I found that didn't even mention ethics or privacy or confidentiality. Or if they did this little rhetorical genuflection to privacy and confidentiality being important, but that was it. They said nothing about how to operate while actually respecting privacy and confidentiality. And that's another thing I think merits full retraction. These methods papers are straight up misleading librarians into bad, unethical research and assessment practices. It is not okay, and we need to deal with it. I am not pretending cleaning this mess up will be fast or easy or uncontroversial. How long have I been in and around libraries? I know better. Heck, I'm the one sitting on a journal rejection, right? I know you know better too. But I ain't mad. I ain't mad. I do believe I will manage to get this published. It's just a question of how many journal editors give it the old Roman thumbs down before one of them does what Library Trends did with Roach Motel and what LPC is doing today by inviting me to speak. And I mean, I know lots of y'all are doing righteous work in your roles as editors and as publishers. I know it. I've worked with some of you, yeah? So this is not even a question in my head. What I'm asking you to do today is take that bigger, okay? Because y'all have power as publishers, as editors, as editorial board members who set journal policies, as fundraisers, as peer reviewers, as a community, you have power. And though that power can be abused and sometimes is, for the protection of patrons, among other things, it is unfortunately necessary that someone have that power, and you are in the hot seat. So part of your job is wielding your power responsibly, threading the needle between editorial standards and censorship. But in my estimation, too many folks involved with LIS publishing are not using their power right. They're wasting everybody's time on can she say that library nice nonsense when there are actual ethics violations happening right under everybody's noses. As a profession, I repeat, we cannot fix what we won't let anyone acknowledge. So let's retrain our attention on this mess and let's clean it up. And let's talk out loud and in public about the cleanup process, because maybe that even helps de-mess research and publishing ethics in other data-centric fields, who knows? Some ideas. I always have ideas. I have some ideas about how to go about fixing this. Requiring ethics statements from authors, as the journal portal is doing, is a start. Though I disagree with Portal, actually, that these issues are restricted to library learning analytics. I think we got broader problems with patron data use and abuse. So hey, having actual policy about acceptable and unacceptable use of patron data would be good. I think it makes sense to look at your policies for expression of concern and retractions to make sure that you're covered if you have to respond to serious ethics issues. Once you have those policies, you put authors and reviewers on notice about them, you add them to manuscript evaluation processes. That's really important. I don't think you have to go this alone. We have a fair few ethicists in LIS. I think it's fair to ask them to serve as watchdogs on editorial boards. And there's no reason every journal has to do this on its own. Isn't that what organizations like LPC are for? And finally, I'm going to repeat one more suggestion that I'll probably have to take some lumps for: retract the unethical stuff. We should not have published it. We should not have allowed it to be presented. And we collectively need to take our lumps for that. Editorial apology, promise to do better, wouldn't go amiss. You can do this if you choose to, and I hope that you will. I'll also say this: I will have a ton of respect and admiration for any librarian, any LIS researcher who asks their publication outlet to retract their library learning analytics work on ethical grounds. Seriously, I will pass them the aspirin. That is hard. That is gutsy. That is taking your lumps when those lumps really hurt. Any librarian with the strength of character to do that, we should be proud of. And if it happens, you have my word that I will be proud out loud. We all screw up. I've screwed up plenty. I've been forgiven a time or two even, and I am willing to forgive. I think we all should be. As upset as I am about this, and I am upset, I am absolutely not out to hurt ordinary librarians doing what ACRL basically told them they were supposed to. I'm resigned to some career damage happening to some of us anyway, mind you, because not everybody's going to retract their own work who should. And I do believe that protecting patrons is more important than librarian careers. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't have done this work at all. But I don't think we can pin all the responsibility here on the librarians who did problematic research and assessment work. As I keep saying, somebody published that stuff. And I absolutely don't think we should use them as scapegoats, which is another thing that we as a profession are way too fond of doing to our own. So if you perhaps notice that the only study whose authors I named today was a study that I could honestly praise, yeah, that was deliberate. All the dirt is in the data, gonna make the data public. all the dirt's in the article, it has to be. And I will say some of that article is blunt and some of it's harsh, because I don't know how else to counteract all the hype around surveillance assessment right now. If Library Nice was going to work, it would have worked already. Plenty of people have tried it. But in this context today, where I have a soapbox and people can't easily talk back to me, naming names would not be right, so I didn't. See, did learn something from my Minnesota screw up. Finally, I think that LPC specifically has a real opportunity here. Y'all are revising and updating your ethical framework for library publishing. There's a session on it in this very forum, and I will be there. And you already have some privacy and website analytics stuff in the current version, and it's really good stuff. I like it a lot. But the question of students and library patrons generally as research and assessment subjects, as library surveillance targets, that's not here yet. I'd love for it to be in the new version if it's not too late for that. And if I can help with it, please call on me. I really think this is important, and I would be honored to pitch in. Otherwise, I fear we end up in my favorite Tom Stoppard play, wondering when the moment was when we should have said no to doing exploitative and invasive data surveillance to patrons, and worrying that we missed that moment. Now is that moment. Now actually is the moment for LIS Publishing to lead librarianship, to lead the rest of the publishing world in saying no to student surveillance, in saying no to patron surveillance, in saying no to surveillance more generally. So whether I can say that or not, I am saying it out loud and in public. We need to do better, and we need to be better around patron data and around how we take our lumps, all of us. If we in LIS Publishing do not fix this, ain't nobody else gonna fix it for us. Thank you. I hope to see you at the Meet the Keynoters social event later on. I think that's gonna be fun.